Welcome to Loaded and Rolling. I'm your host, Thomas Wasson, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about some technology with the folks at Netradyne. One of the big things has been, of course, in the age of telematics, it used to be visibility, and now it's visibility with cameras, and now we have all of these opportunities to make fleets safer. I wish I had it when I started in trucking, because then I wouldn't have gotten yelled at so much, and so it's a brave new world, but I'm super excited bringing on Adam with Netradyne. We're going to dive into catch up not only what they've been working on, but the company has recently celebrated a 10-year anniversary as well. So going to be diving in. So without further ado, let's welcome on Adam. Welcome to the show, sir.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And, 10 years is a long time with any company, but, working with Netradyne, I'm a single-digit employee. I think I was the first non-engineer hired, or one of the first non-engineers. So it's been quite a journey to be part of building something and then seeing it, saving lives and being being involved in so many of our professional drivers' day-to-day operations.
Well, let's talk about the 10-year journey here, because I think it's illustrative of just how rapidly the technology and capabilities have evolved in this space. Tell us a little bit about some there's always a cool founding origin story. Tell us some of the story here and how this has all evolved, and then we'll dive into the present day.
Well, we were pretty lucky. So the video telematics space was not new, when we entered it. But there was really a great opportunity where you had advanced computing power driven by non-transportation segments. So if you think about the compute power that might have been in the PlayStation or the Xbox to drive those high-powered gaming systems, that same leverage and that same compute started to carry over to other industries. And what that allowed for is smart teams to start to say, what else can we see that's on the road, versus just waiting for that moment of time when maybe the brakes were applied and you can, grab 10, 15 seconds of video. And the big transformation was context, right? So you already had, you earlier said visibility, which was great, but now you have visibility with context. And I think the acceleration in this space is when you have context, you can have very good conversations with drivers, not only coaching them for saying, hey, here's the one or two things you might be how to do better, but here's the 97 things you're doing great. And anytime you start a conversation like that, engagement goes up. And if you can get engagement going up, then all of a sudden adoption goes up. And so, everyone wants to be involved in a project versus being told what to do. You're in a collaboration mode.
Well, that's one of the interesting things has been with the technology. You remember the signs on the back of the trucks? Kyle's my driving, call this number. Yeah. It reminds me of an instance where I spoke to a fleet safety executive, and they said that they were so glad to have these new technologies because people would just call the number if they had a bad day. So they never even got the right feedback. It couldn't even have been the driver's fault. Just some guy named Bob's just really, right. He's having a rough one. He just calls and complains. And so when we're thinking of that evolution in the space, that's one of the ways for operators to not only get the information, but to get the accurate information instead of all this noise where it'd take me hours just to dig and see if someone actually messed up back before we had all these.
Yeah, and some of it's believability, right? So you have, a good management team that's sitting back and they're restricted to their office, their operations center. And, at the end of the day, you have to really decipher what really happened. And if you have more information, it becomes clearer to how to work together. And so, the average driver, if you think about a long haul driver, if they go 100,000 miles a year, that's about 10,000 minutes of driving per month, right? So the legacy systems did a really nice job of telling you what you did wrong for about 3 to 4 minutes a day out of those 10,000 minutes. Doesn't quite seem fair, does it? Now, right? And so a lot of it was conversation. And if you don't believe your driver, then all of a sudden you're biased. And so, having that full 10,000 minutes per month is really powerful because you can reinforce what's going right. You can now have context to what led up to an event. You can look at, operations that happen around the vehicle. Many trucking companies today, they're not just point A to point B. They arrive at a location. The driver has, they have to unload, they have to load, they have to service the customer. All these operations that happen while driving and non-driving, I think, are very important. So visibility starts to extend out, and having all that context certainly creates, I call it, less friction, and in some cases, more increased clarity to what really happened at an event.
And there's a lot of those. You brought up a great point about drivers doing additional roles, because I know in trucking you think of, well, no touch freight. You're going down the road, you drop your trailer off, but there's entire portions of the supply chain where these drivers are having to get out of the rig, go into the back, do all of these things. And so is that kind of opening up a new door to see into kind of their daily experiences? Because I think there's a lot of gripes that drivers and people just tolerate, but at the same time, it's been unseen by management teams and everywhere else until now that we have these capabilities.
You have strapping, you have tarping, you have loading, you have unloading, you have restaging of the dry van, for partial shipments. You have up and down on a hydraulic lift. You have navigation of the forklift. All these different tools that you have to do your job. Each one of them has a conversation of context of, how do I get the best visibility? So one of our products, the D810, our naming convention is pretty simple. It's D for driver eye. The first number is how many cameras that are really empowered. And then the rest of it is kind of versioning, right? So 10, 20, 30, 40. But if I can now have views that are outside the vehicle, inside the trailer, on the sides, and on top of the maybe the fuel pumping stations, on the hydraulic lift, all these different angles start to provide more visibility. And now what we did is we've empowered all these cameras to have some intelligence around them. So when something happens, there's a lot of technical words like edge computing, right? That's a heavy word. I like using the term act now, talk later. Can I figure out what is happening right now, give some direction to the driver, and then we'll talk about it later when you get back, right? So I think that's really the I call it the covenant between technology and the driver. How do I get that driver to be successful in their job as quickly as possible?
One of the things also I noticed inside the trailer cameras, I wish we had that. I know a dedicated routes. You take over it, driver assist unload. There were so many HR comps and claims filed because the drivers would try to pull these boxes out. They'd have the boxes fall. They'd have pallets fall on them. And so one of those ways now that how to get driver buy-in is well, yeah, we got a lot of cameras on these, but at least we'll now know if somebody loaded it wrong. So when you tried to put your little buggy and pull it out, it was incorrectly loaded, when before people would just blame the driver. I feel like a lot of this technology, the driver finally is hey, it's not just me over here.
Well, and that's, when customers ask me, they say, what's the best way to sort of deploy this kind of technology? I think transparency is the best thing, right? Use the use cases that you're trying to solve for. Use the reason you're doing it. Well, there's a heavy burden on the industry itself for litigation, right? So there's a lot of protective elements, but you just really find, a lot of the use cases, your job is hard, right? There's a lot of moving parts. We're not there next to you. It's better if we can see it to, have the right conversation about how to fix it the next time or how to solve it this time. And I think those are really important conversations. And so the more views I can see, or we can see, and then the immediacy of understanding those views, I think that's where video and AI and that whole, that whole mix really comes into context here.
And so let's talk about the safety aspect. One of the things I love in the telematics space is they're finally making safety sexy. Safety and compliance typically was considered more of the stick and no carrot. How is this changing the way that folks are building these safety programs with all of this opportunity? Because now we have all the data, but at the same time, getting the buy-in and getting the impact can be equally as challenging as it is, collecting in the first place.
So I always think about this, and in the case where we've all been in weight loss competitions, right, before, and we've all, worked hard for the first week and lost 5, 7, 10 pounds. And there's always that one gal or guy who loses 20 pounds in the first week. And, the second week we all quit. But when we do lose the weight, what happens over time is some of that weight finds us back, right? We lose 20 pounds, we get 5 back. We lose 15, we get 3 back. What happens is you're not changing, you're not changing your lifestyle. And so in the absence of removing negative events, if you don't populate them with positive events, you go back to the old habits. So one of my favorite things that Netradyne has introduced or has for, we're in the millions and millions of recognized events, is something we call driver stars. Now, a driver star is, I'm going down the highway, a car, I have good following distance, and a car all of a sudden gets right in front of the tractor. And now I got to, be on the edge of my seat to figure out how do I react. Well, most drivers will come off the pedal, come off the throttle, create some space. Great. The other piece that I think is really interesting is the recognition of continuous, now positive behavior. Now, I have a camera in my car, and one of the driver stars is something called a streak. And it says, how many full stops in a row can you get, right? So the first measurement for stop signs is 75 full stops in a row. I challenge everyone to try to go do that, because that includes the stop sign at the gym, in your neighborhood, at the supermarket, all the stop signs you see. And I've never been punched in my arm so many times by my family yelling at me, go, there's nobody here. But, the right thing is left, right, left, go, right? So, once you get into that habit and you're recognized for it, that's where, technology is, becomes sexy, because now it's saying, hey, I know you're doing a good job, not just because you're not, in absence of doing a bad job, you must be doing a good job. I can verify you're doing a good job. And now, you've changed, it's become habit forming, and it's become habit forming in a good way.
Well, it's one of those things as well, when you've got your fleet out of 100 trucks, I always am a fan of the 80-20 rule, like 20% causes 80% of my headaches. Most drivers are doing a good job. Most drivers are doing their due diligence, but it was always challenging to find the ones that you needed to coach. And then if you couldn't coach, you had to escalate. If you couldn't escalate, you had to yada, yada, yada. How are fleets tackling that? Are we starting to see, especially fleets, use this technology and all of these various cameras to actually improve and coach it? So let's say that I identify a problem child. Maybe they don't know about it. Maybe they are just in a hurry. You're working for 11 hours a day driving. It's not easy. How does that work? What's that next step if I'm a fleet and I'm like, crap, I got the cameras. I know I got some good ones, but this one guy, I could use some help. Any best practices on how folks are coaching and developing in addition to measuring?
Yeah, certainly. There's two really solutions that you get when you start using some technology. One is it a training problem across all my fleet? Have I not trained my drivers to, how to navigate a stale yellow, right? Or is it an individual problem, right? Is it the one or two, maybe the new driver, or I'll call it the older driver, who's, set in their ways. So that it allows for that very quickly to sort of determine, how to address the issues. I always when I would talk with customers, and I do talk with customers, is ask them the question is, I bet you know who your worst drivers are. They're like, yes, sir. They're in my office all the time. We're talking all the time. I go, the challenge that I would give to you is find out who your best drivers are. And the scenario that I went through, and I recall one of our customers, he called me up about 2 months later. He said, I do know who my 10 best drivers are. He goes, I have a driver who's been working with me for 8 years and I've never met him. And he's one of my top 10 drivers. He goes, he's in my office once a month now, because now I'm learning from that driver on what's working and how to share it with the other drivers. So the other piece that's really interesting is recognition. Envy is not that expensive. So, you think about, you have 100 people in a room, and you hand out 2 special hats, right? 2, gold hats, black hat, a patch, something that someone else doesn't have. The other 98 people in that room are going to now think, how do I get that? Inversely of saying we're moving 2 people from a room because they're your worst drivers, everyone else in the room now is on the edge of their seat. They're like, how do I get out of here as quickly as possible? But using envy and recognition, is a really powerful tool in a good way, to especially when you're transparent and you share the information of how you got there.
That was interesting because I started back in the day at U.S. Express, and we had million milers, millions of accident-free miles, and that was really
it may take you 10 years to get that special moment, right? Why not do it once a week? Here's what you did great this week and better than everyone. I mean, 10 years. 10 years. I've been at Netradyne 10 years. If I'm waiting 10 years for an attaboy, right? After 10 years of working at Netradyne, I'm probably a little frustrated. Like, I'm not being seen. So, that million miles is an incredible milestone, but takes too long, right? Right.
You got to make it like aspirational. Yeah. It's something like, because I know some do badges, some do patches, special hats. I think that's something, it ties into retention, because now we can finally quantify who to give the accolades to, when before, like you said, you just had to stick around long enough and be safe. How many people who may have quit or may have left because they didn't get that recognition? There's all these second and third order effects that we're finally starting to kind of address.
Absolutely. Early days, it was, cameras were like a little bit like selling snake oil. People were like, no, I can't. But, I think that having the context and the visibility to like have an overlay on top of all the tough jobs that you have, loading, unloading, tarping, strapping, moving freight around inside the trailer, navigating boxes, like you said, all that, it's hard work. The best thing that we can do is be fair, transparent, and try to make that job, as safe as possible.
And let's talk a little bit about, while we're working through, one of the things I was curious about is, I'm blanking. That's how I knew we record these things. I'm going to talk about partnerships in a minute, but when we're thinking of the positive reinforcements, getting the patches, getting the recognition, is that one of the things where... Let's go to partnerships. All right, my brain's blanking. Talk about your recent partnerships, and it'll come back around. I'm going to randomly interrupt you and say we need to go talk about this one thing.
Yeah, so I think it's our interaction with the drivers. It's not just exclusive to, like, I'll call it good driving, right? So there are moments like making sure that the driver, if they're drifting off, they're drowsy. That we have that preventive layer, right? How do we get in front of a driver? And, the internal camera, that's a big discussion point. Do I want to be recorded? Do I not want to be recorded? There's certainly hybrid technologies that, Netradyne, we have an option where we can use the sensor to remind the driver, it looks like you're getting drowsy, but not record the video, right? So again, it's how do you use technology to work with how the fleet wants to work versus having the fleet change how they work because of technology, right? So drowsy driving is a great example. If you have drivers who do not want to be recorded, that doesn't mean you cannot, help them, stay awake. When you start thinking about events that happen on the road and how to do search, right? How to really go and find out what really happened, being able to navigate hours and we talked about 10,000 minutes a month, right? If the driver comes back and says, I think sometime between Tuesday and Wednesday, somebody cut me off and I think they hit my front quarter panel and that's what the damage happened. Well, now an operations manager or maintenance manager has to go look at a couple hundred hours of video to find out what really happened. AI and tools that are now incorporated now allow you to go and essentially search imagery. I need to find any moment of time in where there was contact with my video. So now I have hours of video that can be shrunken down to here's 3 thumbnails that you can look at to get you right there. So, saving time and working together, it doesn't only happen inside the vehicle, but it also happens afterwards where, you want to resolve issues. Again, it's all quality of life. Quality of life of the driver who's on the road, and the quality of life after they, get done with their job.
Adam, I remember what it was. It did come around full circle midway through. It is adoption rates. And so one of the things I read across the industry, the adoption rates of road-facing cameras has gotten very big. Adoption rates for driver-facing cameras are growing, but still a small amount. Is there any kind of rule of thumb on how much fleets are adopting? Any numbers, anecdotal evidence? How are we looking at in terms of the adoption strategy as this technology continues to get cheaper, more powerful, easier to use, et cetera?
Well, having hybrid strategies like Netradyne does, where I can either have it on or off or use it kind of in that halfway mode, certainly elevate the conversation and elevate the use cases. I would suggest, if I was to answer that question, if you're a private fleet, and the driver is wearing the uniform and he's part of the delivery process, more and more fleets are interested in the internal camera because the driver is so integrated into that whole service experience. Of course, there's the other spectrum where you have, independent operators who are contracted for freight. They have their own set of rules, and they might say, "Hey, I'm going to pick up a load from A to B. I'll get it there. You don't need to see me." So, across all segments, there's an increase in I call it internal camera being on. But it's not universal. There's certainly still more segments it's more popular for many use cases. In other segments, it's, it's pick and choose, depending on the set of drivers and the set of contractors that you work with.
And final thoughts as well. We got a little bit of time left. Looking ahead, 2026 is coming up. Or if we have this in 2026, it may have already arrived. But regardless, what's up for Netradyne in the coming year? Any plans, any cool stuff, any recent news that folks should be aware of?
Yeah, I talked about search a little bit. And search is very interesting because you think about your personal experience on search. Right, we all used to use great tools like Chrome and Google, and we'd put in a buzzword, show me something about Luke Skywalker, and we'd get 27 articles about Luke Skywalker. Now that you start using some of the open AI tools, like a ChatGPT or a Claude, now you can say, "Hey, I want to know the backstory of Luke Skywalker and the relationship with Darth Vader." It's a crazy example, but now all of a sudden you get a very descriptive paragraph that answers your question. That same application is now being deployed, for video telematics. I want to know, where did I have an exchange where any of my drivers had impaired visibility because of fog? Or I want to know any driver that was delayed because of a lock gate. Or I have a last mile delivery fleet, any driver who could not get out of their vehicle because there was a dog on the scene. Right. So all these things become much more prompt-based searching elements. And what it allows for is fleets now to operate how they want to operate, and, versus changing how they operate, because that's how technology allows them to operate. So I really think there's a lot of freedom that's being unlocked, where a fleet who's got a great business model doesn't have to change their business model to incorporate technology. The technology now incorporates into their great business model.
You've answered one of the questions. I was wondering why I used Grok for mine. Instead of a traditional Google search, you're right, it turned into this conversational style, longer form, where you can actually get more than just that first level. And so you think that's one of the big things to watch. Key takeaways into next year is fleets are now able to ask more questions that beforehand would have required way more time, a business analyst, a process, fill out a ticket, put it in Jira, cry a little bit, hate life. Now we can just ask with the prompt, and with these generative AI tools, we can actually get these kinds of answers and go deeper below the surface than what we previously could.
So think about that application. It's not just for fleet safety. It could be for fuel, for maintenance. I want to know all the cases where I hopped a curb because I got some tire wear. I want to know anytime I was at a location where I was maybe detained, burning up hours because I couldn't unload my vehicle. That's good for compliance. I want to know locations where I couldn't go down a road that previously I thought I could for tracking and dispatching. Think about fuel management, right? The cases where, the driver might have better opportunities to turn off the vehicle, turn on the vehicle, or have different shifting patterns. So all these, I call it these observational prompts, are going to improve not only safety, but also fleet management pieces. So that's exactly where, Netradyne's thinking about 26, and we've been thinking about it for a while, but 26 will be a fun year for us.
All right, cool. I'll check them out. Check them out, Netradyne. Give them a shout. Good people. Technology is really getting there. I encourage everyone to check it out. That's a wrap for this episode. If you're just joining us, we're on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you can find your podcast needs. While you're at it, subscribe to Loaded and Rolling, the newsletter. It goes out every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. That's a wrap for me. I'm Thomas Wasson. I'll see you again soon.